A single number now defines the catastrophe that has struck Colombia, 7.4. It is the magnitude of the earthquake that tore through the country, that shook the city of Pereira and left it in ruins, that toppled buildings and buried neighborhoods and plunged a nation into crisis. To most people, that number is abstract, a figure reported in the news that conveys, vaguely, that the earthquake was large. But behind that number lies an immense and precise reality, a measure of a release of energy so vast it staggers the imagination, and understanding what a magnitude 7.4 earthquake actually is, how it is measured, how much power it unleashes, how that power travels through the earth and shakes the surface, and why it is capable of leaving a city in ruins, is the key to understanding the disaster in Pereira. This is the story of that number and the terrible power it represents, of the science of the shaking earth, and of how a release of energy deep beneath the ground can rise up to shatter a city and change countless lives in the span of a minute. What the number really means to understand the disaster in Pereira. You first have to understand what the magnitude of an earthquake actually measures, because the number is far more meaningful and far more alarming than most people realize. When scientists assign a magnitude, they are measuring the amount of energy released by the earthquake, the sheer power of the event as the accumulated stress along a fault is suddenly let loose. Magnitude is a measure of the size of the earthquake at its source, an objective quantification of how much energy was unleashed when the earth broke and shifted, and it is determined by measuring the seismic waves the earthquake sends out, recorded by instruments called seismometers around the world. But here is the crucial and often misunderstood feature of the magnitude scale. It is not a simple linear scale, where each number is just a little bigger than the last. It is a logarithmic scale, which means that each whole number represents a dramatic multiplying increase in the size of the earthquake. Moving up the scale by one whole number does not mean an earthquake is slightly larger. It means it is many times larger in the amplitude of its shaking and represents a vastly greater release of energy. The difference between one magnitude and the next is enormous, so a magnitude 7 earthquake is not merely a bit bigger than a magnitude 6, but represents a release of energy many times greater. This logarithmic nature of the scale is what makes a magnitude 7.4 earthquake so profoundly powerful, because it sits high on a scale where each step represents an explosive multiplication of energy, placing it among the large and destructive earthquakes capable of catastrophic damage. When you understand that the scale multiplies with each number rather than simply adding, the significance of a 7.4 becomes clear. It is not just a big earthquake, but an enormous release of energy, a convulsion of the earth on a scale capable of devastating a city. The number 7.4 is in truth a measure of a titanic force, and understanding its meaning is the first step to comprehending the catastrophe it has wrought in Pereira. The energy unleashed to grasp just how much power a magnitude 7.4 earthquake represents. It helps to think about the energy involved, because the energy released by a large earthquake is almost beyond human comprehension, a force on a scale that dwarfs the works of humanity. When an earthquake occurs, the energy that had accumulated over years, decades, or even centuries as the great plates of the Earth's crust pressed against one another, building up stress along the faults, is released in a matter of seconds. That accumulated stress is unleashed all at once when the fault finally breaks, and the energy that pours out is staggering. The energy released by a large earthquake like the one that struck Pereira is comparable to the detonation of an immense quantity of explosives, a release of power that rivals or exceeds the most powerful weapons ever created, all of it unleashed deep within the earth and radiating outward in every direction. This energy does not stay confined to where the earthquake begins. It travels outward through the earth as waves, carrying the power across great distances, and it is when these waves reach the surface and the cities and towns upon it that the energy does its destructive work. The sheer scale of the energy involved is what makes a large earthquake such a formidable and terrifying force of nature. A release of power that human beings can neither prevent nor control, only endure and prepare for. And this energy, released in the depths of the earth beneath Colombia, is the ultimate source of the devastation in Pereira, the power that toppled the buildings and shattered the city, a force accumulated over the long ages of the Earth's restless movement and unleashed in a single terrible moment. To understand the disaster is to understand this energy and the way that power, born deep in the Earth, rose up to devastate the surface. The waves that carry the destruction, the energy of an earthquake, does not simply appear everywhere at once. It travels from the source of the earthquake outward through the Earth in the form of seismic waves. And understanding these waves is key to understanding how the power of the earthquake reaches and devastates a city like Pereira. When the fault breaks and the energy is released, it radiates outward as different kinds of waves, each traveling through the Earth in its own way, and each contributing to the shaking felt at the surface. Some of these waves travel through the interior of the Earth, moving outward from the source in all directions, and they are the first to arrive at any given place, the initial signal that an earthquake has occurred. Other waves travel along the surface, and these surface waves are often the most destructive, because they carry much of the earthquake's energy and produce the strong, rolling, shaking motion that damages and destroys buildings. As these waves pass through a location, they shake the ground, moving it back and forth and up and down, and it is this shaking, produced by the passage of the seismic waves, that subjects the buildings to the forces that can destroy them. The waves lose energy as they travel farther from the source. So the shaking is generally strongest near the origin of the earthquake and diminishes with distance, which is why the areas closest to the source typically suffer the worst damage. The seismic waves are thus the mechanism by which the energy of the earthquake, released deep in the earth, is carried to the surface and delivered to the cities and towns. In Pereira, it was these waves, radiating out from the source, that shook the city and brought down its buildings, the energy of the great release traveling through the earth to strike the surface with devastating force. Where and how deep, two factors beyond the raw magnitude profoundly influence how much damage an earthquake causes at a given place. And understanding them is essential to understanding why the disaster in Pereira is so severe, the location of the earthquake, and its depth. The magnitude tells you how much energy was released, but where that energy is released, and how deep beneath the surface determines how much of it reaches a particular city and how destructive it is there. The location matters because the shaking is strongest near the point on the surface directly above where the earthquake originates, the place called the epicenter, and diminishes with distance from there. An earthquake whose epicenter is close to a populated city will subject that city to far stronger shaking than one whose epicenter is far away. So the same magnitude earthquake can be catastrophic for a nearby city and barely felt by a distant one. When a large earthquake strikes close to a populated area, as in Pereira, the full force of the shaking is delivered to the city, with devastating results. The depth matters too, because earthquakes can originate at various depths, and a shallow earthquake, originating close to the surface, delivers its energy with less distance for the waves to travel and lose strength, producing stronger shaking than a deeper earthquake of the same magnitude. A shallow earthquake beneath a city can be especially destructive, concentrating its energy on the surface directly above, while a deeper earthquake, its energy spread over a greater distance to reach the surface, may cause less damage. The combination of a large magnitude, a nearby location, and a shallow depth is the recipe for maximum destruction, the alignment of factors that produces the most catastrophic earthquakes, and it is this kind of alignment that turns an earthquake into a disaster, like the one that has left Pereira in ruins. The number 7. 4 tells only part of the story. It is the magnitude combined with the where and the how deep that determines the full scale of it. Magnitude is not the same as intensity. There is an important distinction in the science of earthquakes that helps explain why the same earthquake affects different places so differently. The difference between the magnitude of an earthquake and its intensity. These two terms are often confused, but they measure different things, and both are needed to understand an earthquake's effects. Magnitude, as we have seen, is a measure of the size of the earthquake at its source, the amount of energy released, a single number that describes the earthquake itself regardless of where it is felt. An earthquake has one magnitude. Intensity, by contrast, is a measure of the strength of the shaking and the effects at a particular place, and it varies from location to location depending on the distance from the source, the depth, the nature of the ground, and other factors. A single earthquake with a single magnitude produces different intensities in different places, high intensity near the epicenter, where the shaking is strong and the damage severe, and lower intensity farther away, where the shaking is weaker and the damage less. Intensity is what people actually experience, and what determines the damage at a given location, and it is why the disaster in Pereira is so severe there, while other places felt the earthquake less powerfully. The magnitude 7.4 describes the earthquake's total energy, but it is the intensity of the shaking in Pereira, produced by the combination of the magnitude, the proximity, the depth, and the local conditions that determine the devastation there. Understanding the distinction clarifies why a single earthquake can be catastrophic in one place and barely noticed in another, and why the number that describes the earthquake as a whole must be combined with an understanding of local conditions to comprehend the actual effects on any given city. In Pereira, the intensity was severe, the shaking violent, and the result was a city in ruins. The ground that shook when the seismic waves reached Pereira, the ground itself shook with tremendous violence. And understanding what that shaking actually does, how it moves the ground and everything upon it, brings the abstract science of magnitude and waves down to the terrible reality experienced by the people of the city. The shaking of the ground in a strong earthquake is not a gentle swaying, but a violent, chaotic motion, throwing the surface back and forth and up and down with great force. Powerful enough to knock people off their feet, topple objects, and tear buildings apart. As the seismic waves pass, the ground moves in complex ways, and the buildings upon it are subjected to the forces of that motion. The violence of the shaking near the source of a large, shallow earthquake is extraordinary, a convulsion of the solid earth that transforms the dependable ground into a heaving, treacherous surface. For the people of Pereira, this shaking was the immediate reality of the disaster, the moment when the earthquake, born of the release of energy deep in the earth and carried to the surface by the seismic waves, became a terrifying physical experience, the ground itself turning violent beneath their feet. The shaking is what people feel, what terrifies them, and what does the damage. The direct physical manifestation of all the energy and the waves and the science, and it is the shaking that brings down the buildings, subjecting the structures to forces they may not withstand, and it is in the failure of those buildings under the violent shaking that the human tragedy of the earthquake unfolds. The ground that shook in Pereira was the surface expression of the great release of energy, the point where the power of the earthquake met the world of human beings, and its violence was the immediate cause of the catastrophe. Why Colombia feels this power of the disaster in Pereira is not an isolated accident, but the manifestation of the powerful geological forces that make Colombia prone to earthquakes, and understanding why this region unleashes such energy places the magnitude 7.4 earthquake in its proper context, as an expression of the restless earth beneath the country. Colombia sits in one of the most seismically active regions of the world, a place where the great plates of the Earth's crust meet and interact, generating the stress that is periodically released in earthquakes. Off the western coast, one of the great tectonic plates is diving beneath the edge of the South American continent, a process that has built the towering Andes Mountains and that generates enormous forces within the Earth. These forces do not stay confined to the coast, but reach inland, fracturing the crust into a complex network of faults, the lines along which the crust breaks and shifts when the accumulated stress becomes too great. It is the sudden movement along these faults that produces earthquakes, and Colombia, laced with such faults and subjected to the relentless forces of the colliding plates, is capable of generating large and powerful earthquakes. The magnitude 7.4 earthquake that struck Pereira is an expression of these forces, the release of energy accumulated over time along one of the faults that thread through the country. This is why the country feels such power. It sits upon restless, fractured ground, where the great forces of the earth are constantly at work, building toward the releases of energy that produce earthquakes like the one that has devastated Pereira. The power of the earthquake is, in the end, the power of the earth itself, the vast forces of the moving plates unleashed upon the surface. And Colombia's position amid these forces is the reason it experiences such catastrophic events. The aftershocks to come, the release of energy in a great earthquake, is not a single, clean event, but a process that continues in the aftermath. And understanding the aftershocks that follow a large earthquake is important to understanding the ongoing danger to Pereira in the days and weeks after the main shock, when a large earthquake releases the accumulated stress along a fault. The adjustment of the Earth's crust does not happen all at once. The region continues to settle and shift, producing a series of smaller earthquakes, the aftershocks, that follow the main event. These aftershocks, though generally smaller, are themselves the release of additional energy as the crust readjusts, and they can continue for days, weeks, or longer after the main shock. They pose a real and continuing danger because buildings damaged but not destroyed by the main earthquake may be weakened and unstable, and an aftershock can finish the job, collapsing structures that were already compromised. The aftershocks keep the region on edge, prolong the fear and the danger, and complicate the rescue and recovery efforts, a continuing manifestation of the seismic energy that the great earthquake set in motion. For the people of Pereira, the aftershocks are a continuing reminder of the disaster and a continuing threat. The release of energy playing out over time as the Earth settles into its new configuration. They are part of the full picture of what a large earthquake is, not a single instantaneous event, but a process of energy release that begins with the main shock and continues through the aftershocks, extending the danger well beyond the terrifying moments of the initial shaking. Understanding this underscores that the danger to Pereira does not end when the main shock is over, but continues as the Earth releases the rest of its accumulated energy in the days and weeks to come. The power we cannot predict for all that science has learned about earthquakes, about their magnitude and energy and waves, there is one crucial thing science cannot do. And understanding this limitation is essential to understanding the danger they pose. Earthquakes cannot be reliably predicted. Despite enormous scientific effort, there is no way to know in advance exactly when and where a large earthquake will strike. No way to give people warning days or weeks ahead that the ground is about to shake. This unpredictability is a fundamental feature of earthquakes, a consequence of the complex, hidden processes deep within the Earth that build toward the sudden release of energy. Scientists can identify the regions where earthquakes are likely, can assess the general hazard, and can even give very brief warnings of seconds once an earthquake has already begun. As the first waves are detected and the stronger shaking still approaches, but they cannot predict the specific earthquake before it happens, cannot tell the people of a city that a great earthquake will strike on a particular day. This means earthquakes strike without warning, as the one that hit Pereira did, giving no time to prepare or evacuate before the shaking begins. The unpredictability of earthquakes is one of the things that makes them so frightening and so dangerous, for it means a city in an earthquake-prone region lives always with the possibility that the ground may shake at any moment, without warning. But this also points toward the response that is possible, since earthquakes cannot be predicted. The way to reduce their toll is to prepare for them in advance, to build structures that can withstand the shaking, to be ready to respond when the earthquake comes. The power of the earthquake cannot be predicted or prevented, but its consequences can be greatly reduced through preparation, and this is the crucial lesson the science of earthquakes ultimately teaches. The meaning of the number in the end, the disaster in Pereira, brings us back to the number that defines it, the magnitude 7.4 that measures the earthquake's power, and to a fuller understanding of what that number truly means and why it matters. That number is not an abstraction, but a measure of a titanic release of energy, a force accumulated over the long ages of the Earth's restless movement and unleashed in a single terrible moment, a power capable of shaking a city to ruins. Understanding the science behind it transforms the abstract report of an earthquake into a comprehension of the immense forces at work and the reasons for the devastation. The magnitude 7.4 tells us that the earthquake was an enormous release of energy, high on the logarithmic scale where each step multiplies the power, among the large and destructive events capable of catastrophe. Combined with its proximity to Pereira and its depth, that magnitude produced an intensity of shaking severe enough to bring down buildings and leave the city in ruins. The energy, released deep in the earth, traveled outward as seismic waves that reached the surface and shook the ground with violent force, subjecting the buildings to the stresses that destroyed them. And the earthquake, an expression of the geological forces that make Colombia prone to such events, struck without warning as earthquakes do, giving no time to prepare. This is the meaning of the number 7.4, and understanding it is understanding the disaster in Pereira, not as a random misfortune, but as the manifestation of the immense and comprehensible forces of the earth. The number is a measure of power, and the ruins of Pereira are the expression of that power, the meeting of the vast energy of the earth with the world of human beings. To understand the number is to understand both the terrible power of the earth and the importance of preparing for it, so that when the ground shakes again, as it surely will in a land of earthquakes, the toll of the power measured